Welcome back, my friends. Jake here. Today on the channel we're going to do another question and answer video. Once a month on the community tab, my YouTube channel, I'll put out a question prompt such as this one. Down below you can ask me anything about anything. Thumbs up the questions you want me to respond to, and I'll respond to as many top-ranked questions as I can in today's video. Thank you to everyone who left a question or read other people's questions. And the top-ranked question was from Daniel Larson, 387 thumbs up. I think that's actually the most ever. And he asks, how can an average US citizen pressure Mike Johnson to allow a vote on aid to Ukraine? If you're an American citizen, this is very important. You can look up how to contact your federal representatives. These are your senators and your congresspeople. And if you just want to make this like a weekly ritual, every Sunday you make a phone call, or you can send an email or send a personal letter. Over time, this does add up, and elected representatives do pay attention to these phone calls, emails, and letters. And if you happen to be represented by a Republican, then at the moment your voice matters more. Doesn't matter if it's Senate or the House, but if you happen to be represented by a House Republican member, then please contact that member and let them know your support for them is conditional on them approving additional military aid to Ukraine. I guarantee you if they get enough phone calls, emails, or letters, it does impact their decision. Aside from that, and this is not going to be a popular opinion, but I think a lot of people gave up on Twitter when Elon Musk bought it. It's painfully transparent. Elon Musk bought Twitter to benefit himself. Every decision he's made on the platform has been centered around what he wants. And I've seen the alternatives, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, and unfortunately our members of Congress don't use those platforms because Twitter has been around so long, and these representatives like Mike Johnson already have a huge following, 600,000. They're just not really using the other platforms to get information or feel the pulse of Americans. So unfortunately, a lot of people who support Ukraine abandon Twitter when this is where the discussion is happening with our members of Congress, which is not a good thing, but that's the reality. So if you're someone who used to be on Twitter and you want to get back on, join in on the discussion, participate in polls, tweet at your representatives. Additionally, if you want to get verified on Twitter, pay Elon Musk $8 a month, then your tweets, your comments get pushed to the top. The system is rigged towards people who pay to play. That's not fair. That's undemocratic, but these are the decisions that Elon Musk has made. These are the rules of the game, and at least until the November election, I'm going to play by these rules to maximize my impact on the platform, on what our representatives are seeing and reading. Next question. How profound will the impact of the complete destruction of the Kerch Bridge be for achieving a Ukrainian victory? What has been stopping the Ukrainians from destroying the bridge so far? What will it take for the Ukrainians to destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge? I think Ukraine has been trying to destroy the bridge. We'll never know how many failed attempts have happened. That'll come out after the war. But this is Russia's #1 priority, to protect it. Whatever list of assets Russia can lay out, protecting the Kerch Strait Bridge is #1. So that's why it's been so difficult to bring it down. If Ukraine's summer counteroffensive had been successful and they had made it to Berdyansk or Melitopol, then with missiles it'd be easier to bring down this bridge. But I do think eventually Ukraine will successfully bring down the bridge at some point this year in 2024. And when this happens, Crimea is isolated. The population of Crimea is almost 2 million people, and they don't have fresh water. When the Russians blew up the Novokakhovka Dam, They deliberately elevated the reservoir levels to increase the flow through the canals, and they were saving water. They were storing up as much water as they can. Not enough water for agriculture, but enough water for the civilian population to drink. But 2 million people on this peninsula, they don't have enough water, they don't have enough food, and if this bridge goes down and the seaways are contested with naval drones, it's going to get bad for the citizens of Crimea. As they run out of food and water, I'm guessing it'll also be difficult to keep the lights on and normal utilities going, but the theory is, this is promoted by General Ben Hodges, if Crimea can be isolated and even partially retaken, that would be such a psychological blow to the Russian people that Putin's regime would collapse. Is that true? I don't know, but it's a good theory. It's better than trying to bust into the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. These are major metropolitan cities, and these cities are going to be harder to take than Crimea, which is why Ukraine is so focused currently in the Kherson region. Next question, do you think the protest in Bashkortostan is an isolated incident or the prelude to more civil unrest in Russia? It's a prelude. Civil war is coming. The only question is how much time. And you can see from these protests with the native Bashkir language, these peoples of Central Eurasia still have their own ethnic identities, their own culture, their own language, separate from the Muscovites. They're colonies. They're territories under the current Russian Empire. And people genuinely favor local representation. You want the people making the decisions over how you live as close to you in proximity as possible. So there's no reason why people living in the Far East or in the Caucasus or Central Asia want to give up their sovereignty and their rights to the elite of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Doesn't matter if they speak the same language, doesn't matter if they're the same religion. People generally would prefer local representation for more control. Is that coming? I think so. When you think about the country of Belarus, it's its own country and it's about 10 million people. Russia today is 140 million people, and what if we just broke up Russia into 14 Belarus-sized countries that all speak Russian as one of their language, but maybe they have another indigenous language? It's going to be complicated, it's going to be messy, everyone's going to be fighting over the natural resources such as gold, oil, natural gas, but Russia did this to themselves. Hi Jake, besides writing our Congress dummies and voting throughout 2024, what can we do in the US to get louder now? Is there someone we can get behind besides you who will champion Ukraine in the USA? Unfortunately, no. We already talked about contacting our representatives. If you're represented by a Republican, it matters more, but the November election is coming up in 289 days. Ukraine's not going to collapse in the next 289 days. So even if Republicans choose to block military aid for the rest of the year, I think there's enough Americans, independents, and even Republicans who support Ukraine where this is a defining issue, where they will vote for only politicians willing to militarily support Ukraine. And then in January of 2025, we can resume military aid. The Russians aren't going to win by January 2025, and Russia might even collapse on their own by January of 2025. This is not a good answer. This is not what we prefer. But the people making the decisions in Congress, such as Speaker Mike Johnson, they don't care about the will of the people. They don't care what the majority wants. They're only serving their small, cloistered, isolated, condensed base. Next question. GLSDB seems to have been delayed again. Any ETA on them? Were they already pledged, or would they only be delivered if additional funding from Congress goes through? I'm kind of speechless about GLSDB. I can keyword search on Google News and no news comes up. The last thing we heard from Boeing and Saab was late November, early December, that GLSDB would be delayed until early 2024. For Boeing and Saab, this is embarrassing. The contracts were signed last November. This was already a proven concept they came up with 7 years ago. So what the heck takes 11 months to build this connector piece and put these two parts together? I don't understand it. I don't know what the delay is. I pushed this on my channel that Boeing and Saab said a summer delivery. They then pushed that to a winter delivery, and now they're pushing it towards a spring delivery. Why? I don't know. But these are contracts that were already signed, funding already allocated, so even though Congress might not approve additional military aid this year, GLSDB will still be delivered once Boeing and Saab feels like doing their job. Dear Jake, can you please talk about the donors that fund Mike Johnson's electoral campaign? Who are the PACs bankrolling him? That is how you influence politicians in the USA. You could make a dedicated video about Mike and his interests in money. I understand the angle you're taking with that question, but I don't actually think this applies to Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson lives in a very safe Republican district in Louisiana. In 2022, he got 60% of the votes. The closest second-tier candidate, a Democrat, got 25%. So Mike Johnson doesn't really need money. He doesn't need to fundraise as an individual member of Congress. But when you become the leader of your party, when you become Speaker of the House, then you do kind of have to work as a fundraising advocate for your members and your party. Is Mike Johnson doing that? It's complicated because elections in the United States in the last 15 years have been changing. That was the old traditional model that single large donors dominated the parties because they had all the money. But this was pre-internet, with Howard Dean in 2004 and Barack Obama in 2008. They were the first politicians to master small donations and the internet. As soon as politicians could fund their own campaigns, getting hundreds of thousands of people to all give them $5, you don't need the big money donors smoking cigars in the back room. So when we look at how expensive congressional races are every 2 years, these are the most expensive ones in Georgia, $27 million, California, $26 million. But what's the average? And a lot of members of the House have figured this out, that if they take provocative stances, if they say inflammatory things, if they do everything to draw attention to themselves, and they can build a national presence, then hundreds of thousands of people will all give them $5, and they don't have to talk to the big super PACs or the large donors. Like, this is a shift happening in American politics. Here's an excellent video from Peter Zeihan. He talks about this as well. Trump's disqualification, how we got here. I'll link this down below if you want to hear Peter's opinion on how US elections are changing. But as far as who funds Mike Johnson, and I don't think Mike Johnson worries about general election campaigns anymore. He lives in a safe district. Do you think now is a good time for Japan to retake its occupied islands? For those who don't know, these are the Kuril Islands. And at the end of World War II, the Soviets were island hopping, preparing for a mainland invasion of Japan. One of the reasons why Truman felt so pressured to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the United States wanted Japan to surrender to us unconditionally rather than let the Soviets do a mainland invasion and take Japan by force. Given how history turned out, I think Japan was a lot better off being a protectorate of the United States during Reconstruction as opposed to the Soviets. But I think Russia's going to have to collapse, fall into civil war before Japan would make a move to retake these islands. These islands have always belonged to Japan. Russia has no legitimate claim to them, aside from they took them militarily after World War II. But I think it's inevitable. You know, Putin keeps talking about respecting historical borders. Well, that argument makes a lot of sense to the Japanese and even to the Chinese. So Russia has that to look forward to once their stupid country collapses. Jake, can you give us some insight into the upcoming U.S. presidential election? The poll numbers are worrying. How likely is it that the next president will be anti-Ukraine? Also, is there a theoretical way for House Democrats to strike a bipartisan deal with Republicans to remove Johnson? Can Democrats promise to support another Republican speaker? This scenario is what I'm hoping will happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but Speaker Johnson needs to be removed and betrayed by at least 3 members of his own caucus. It's pretty dangerous to do when you alienate your entire party just before an election. So realistically, for House Republicans to do this, these would have to be members that want to retire and want to get out of government, and they don't care about their reelection. As far as the presidency, let's just talk about it. Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. I've been following this website, I think, since like 2002, and it's not changed in 20 years, but it's called electoral-vote.com, and I think it's a really basic website to get information about presidential elections here in the United States. So the Republican primary is currently happening, and Donald Trump will be the nominee, but I am not impressed by how he's performed so far. We've got the New Hampshire primary coming up on Monday, but Trump got 51% of the vote in the Iowa caucus. But for all intents and purposes, he's the incumbent. Given that he once was president and he wants to be president again, 49% of Republican primary voters want somebody new, want somebody else, whether it's Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, or even Vivek Ramaswamy. Everyone knows that Trump was the president and wants to be president again, and 49% said, no, I'd like somebody else. That's not a vote of confidence. And when we look at the 2020 presidential election, I know people are going to say that it was rigged and it was stolen, but there's zero evidence for that. If you have proof the election was rigged or stolen, present it in court. There are 6 Republican-appointed judges on the Supreme Court, and they would like to see that evidence. But none exists. And Joe Biden got 7 million more votes than Donald Trump. Everyone in the United States has made up their mind about Joe Biden. He's been a national figure since he was elected vice president in 2008, and everyone has already made up their mind on Trump. Not too many people are going to be switching their votes, and it is about voter turnouts, and Donald Trump is just a vote turnout machine, both for him and against him. It's not really about Joe Biden, and nobody really cares about all this Hunter Biden stuff. So, in my opinion, the 2024 election is just going to be a repeat. The reason why the polls look close now is because Joe Biden's not spending any money. He's not even really campaigning. As long as Trump is distracted in a primary fighting with Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, the Democrats can conserve their gunpowder and wait for that home blitz in September, October, November, and I'm still waiting to hear something from Trump that would change anyone's mind about Trump, and he's a broken record. He just keeps saying the same things over and over. We often hear the phrase game-changing used. How game-changing will F-16s be when they are fully operational? I've watched these videos of Ukrainian pilots talking about F-16s, and what they really want is the onboard radar system. The AN/APG-68s, they can see in the skies up to 296 kilometers or 184 miles away. Meaning that once Ukrainians are flying these F-16s, they can see Russian jets or helicopters before they'll be spotted. They can then fire off air-to-air missiles, and this is going to decimate Russia's aviation. Once Russia can no longer safely fly over the occupied territories, then these F-16s are going to be flying combat missions to drop glide bombs on important Russian positions. And what the F-16 does is it unlocks all of these missiles. NATO was never designed to fight a ground war with artillery. That's why NATO's inventories of artillery were depleted so fast. The reason why is NATO never game planned to fight a war without their planes, without their air superiority. So once Ukraine has these F-16s, there's just a lot of missiles that NATO countries from their inventories can donate. And these are all going to go boom on Russian positions this year. Why don't Republicans in Congress who support Ukraine put strong pressure on Speaker Johnson to have a vote? Is Trump the invisible hand behind all these problems about helping the Ukraine people? Yes, Speaker Mike Johnson has publicly said that he frequently is talking with Donald Trump on the phone. He did go down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with him in November, right after he became the speaker. And Trump does not support Ukraine. This is painfully obvious to anyone. I know there are people planning to vote for Trump, and they also support Ukraine. Those two things conflict, and I understand people are going to make decisions based on other factors, so I'm not taking it personal. But you guys know where my positions are. This is a single-issue political channel. I'm only going to advocate people vote for and support politicians who support democracy and support Ukraine. And for whatever reason, Trump does not support Ukraine. We could get into the history of when he and Zelensky were talking back in 2018, 2019, but we all know what's going on. And this is unfortunate, in my opinion, for Speaker Johnson, because he is the second most powerful man in our government. The vice president doesn't really have any true power, so as far as power in our government, it's the president and then the Speaker of the House. And Mike Johnson could be his own man. He could exert his own will and his own influence, set his own agenda. But given that he's only been in Congress for like 4 or 5 years, he doesn't have his own legs to stand on. He's looking for direction, and the conference, the GOP caucus, is pro-Trump, and he's just going to do whatever his caucus wants, otherwise he'll be removed. So when we talk about Republicans in the House who support Ukraine, there's probably about 150 of them. It's the vast majority. But it's not their most important issue. There are other issues they care about more. Gun control, abortion, immigration, border security, whatever. So they're not willing to remove Speaker Johnson over the issue of Ukraine because there are other issues they care about more in which they want Speaker Johnson to stay in his position. If you want to look up the report card on GOP members, how they voted on Ukraine, I'll put this link down below to the website's GOP for Ukraine. And it just shows the voting record of individual members. Like here's Lauren Boebert, and she's an F, very poor. But we've got, for example, Colorado Representative Ken Buck, and he's a A-, very excellent. Next question. We have all been waiting for GLSDB for quite some time now. How do you think these weapons will impact the battlefield this winter or spring? Do you think these missiles will be delivered in the quantity that Ukraine needs? Also, in regards to ATACMS, Biden authorized only a few, but we haven't seen them since. What's the deal with that? I think Biden at this point is waiting to send more ATACMS until Congress approves additional military aid. That's the short answer for that one. So I do think more ATACMS are coming, but Congress has to do their job now and vote to militarily support Ukraine. Concerning GLSDB and the quantity, I don't know. Last February, Boeing and Saab sold this to me that it would be easy to build this connector, this interstage adapter, because the United States has countless small diameter GBU bombs. The United States has tens of thousands of these M26 rocket motors. So just put them together. It should be cheap, something like $50,000 per unit or whatever, and these glide bombs can go for 150 kilometers. So if Boeing and Saab send 100 and then pat themselves on the back, then this was a waste of money and time. But if Boeing and Saab can mass produce these and send 10,000, then yes, these are pretty large 300 kilogram bombs or whatever being dropped on Russian positions within 150 kilometers of the front lines. They should be launchable from HIMARS and M270, so I don't know. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing on the internet explaining what the holdup is. Question, why do many US say Ukraine is a EU problem because of proximity when the US disarmed and promised to protect Ukraine? I think you're referring to the Budapest Memorandum, signed in December of 1994. And unfortunately, this is not a US treaty. For it to be a treaty, Congress has to vote on it, and Bill Clinton didn't want to involve Congress. So this was a presidential executive memorandum signed by Bill Clinton, and as soon as Bill Clinton left office in the year 2000, the Budapest Memorandum more or less stopped being a thing. This is not a good answer. This is not fair to Ukraine. This makes the United States look bad. Generally, presidents should care and enforce actions from presidents of previous administrations just to be consistent, so that our international partners, our international allies can trust the word of the United States. But there's some interesting political leaders who don't care about previous commitments, previous guarantees, previous thinking about global security. This makes the United States look bad. Fewer people in the future will negotiate with us in good faith because depending on who gets elected in the next 4 years, they could pull a 180. It's America's reputation being trashed abroad, but we're not there yet. I do believe that the United States will continue supporting Ukraine this year. It's just a political process we got to get through this month. Hi Jake, do you think that Western countries could find a legal way to seize the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets and send that money to support Ukraine? I do think we're going to make progress on this year. I think the plan was always to have this frozen money go towards Ukraine's reconstruction, but the plan was to get Russia to go along with that plan. In order for sanctions to be lifted, in order for there to be an end to the fighting, Russia was going to have to agree to allow frozen assets to go towards Ukraine's reconstruction. But we're heading towards a complete collapse of Russia, and there might not be a central government capable of making that decision. Additionally, with this war lasting longer than anyone thought, we're now just going to seize this money to fund Ukraine's war efforts. But there has to be a legal process, and ideally Russia gets representation in court. So what the Russians are already planning to do is to obstruct and delay any kind of legal process that the West takes to seize their money, They're just going to obstruct and delay the judicial process, hoping they can defeat Ukraine before Ukraine gets any of that money. And unfortunately, Western banks are going to help Russia. The reason why is Western banks don't want governments seizing assets stored in their banks, because that sets a dangerous precedent that if you're a dictator or a human rights abuser with money in Western banks, then maybe Western governments can seize that money through whatever judicial process they want. This will scare all the dictators and strongmen around the world to pull their money out of Western banks and relocate it to Chinese banks, or maybe like Switzerland or Abu Dhabi or whatever. But it's happening. Russia is making this so difficult on the world that this is a new legal process we have to set in motion. So yes, this will set a precedent for other authoritarian regimes around the world that would prefer to keep their money in Western banks. Last question. When and why did Republicans switch from being war hawks to dictator appeasers? And I don't know. I mean, if Ronald Reagan was alive today, he'd be a Democrat voting for Joe Biden, based purely on foreign policy. What House Republicans are currently doing with NATO and our Democratic allies, flirting with the Russians. No, I don't think Ronald Reagan would approve of this. But concerning, and I want to highlight this point, switching from war hawks to dictator appeasers. The United States has never had a problem with dictators. The Cold War was fought over communism. So if you were a dictator willing to not work with the communists, willing to ally yourselves with pro-capitalist Western forces, then you were fine. The United States propped up and protected a lot of dictators during the Cold War just to prevent those countries from falling to the communists. The Shah of Iran, not really a unifying democratic force. Saddam Hussein was America's ally in the 1980s. But he wasn't communist. And I think the best example is Park Chung-hee, who was the dictator of South Korea between 1963 and 1979. So this guy was the dictator of one of America's closest allies for 16 years during the Cold War. And the reason why the United States wouldn't let South Korea be a democracy is if you let the South Korean people vote, would they have voted to reunify with the North under communism? And the cynical answer is, I think, yes. Maybe not in the 1980s, but in the 1960s and 70s, this was a very appealing argument towards impoverished people. What if we just killed the ruling elite, stole their property and land, and redistributed to the peasants? That usually can win you a majority in an election. So the United States had a huge problem with all these countries around the world trying to prevent them from going communist. But as soon as the USSR collapsed, as soon as communism was defeated in 1992, then a lot more countries got to become democracies, including South Korea. They had their first free and fair elections really in 1994, and they've been a thriving democracy for almost 30 years, but it's complicated. History is complicated. And the United States has always had political factions oscillating between interventionism to promote democratic values and then isolationism to just say, we're only going to worry about the Americas, the old worlds, they're on their own, but given the events of World War I and World War II, that's not a good strategy, and it's always been proven bad. The debate continues. The grand experiment continues, and I'm contributing to it, making these videos. You're participating by watching these videos. I thank you for remaining informed and remaining engaged. That's all for this Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone who participated. We'll do another one next month. Until then, take care, everyone.